Scholar transport is once again under the spotlight after 11 pupils were killed on their way to school. This is in Mirafong, west of Johannesburg last week. According to reports, the minibus taxi they were traveling in overturned and burst into flames after being hit by a bakkie from behind. The social justice activist Busi Seabe joins me now to chat more about this issue. Busi, good to have you on the program despite the circumstances. In light of these recent events, what immediate measures do you think should be taken to really enhance safety in scholar transport systems across the country?
Thank you very much for having me, and we must first off send our condolences to all the families that have been affected by this tragedy. I think it's important for us to understand that this is an issue that needs to be tackled from different tiers in society, from national government all the way down to provincial government and parents as well, including service providers themselves. It's important to understand that all private, transport service providers must be registered with the Department of Basic Education and the roads and transport departments in their respective provinces to ensure that we're able to follow up on licensing issues, to follow up on roadworthy testing of vehicles, and to follow up as well on professional driving permits. If indeed the department is serious about their responsibility of regulating and making sure that vehicles are compliant, they must institute mechanisms to verify private transport service providers and ensure that they are safe and compliant. It is unacceptable that children will be packed inside a minibus taxi like sardines, and there are no repercussions for service providers. I think it's also important for us to bring drivers themselves into the conversation. Because when you look at private transport services, it's important to understand that they create job opportunities and they are affordable and reliable transporting services for parents and learners. We can't shy away from that. And this is why we must ensure that private transport providers have PDPs, that their vehicles are compliant and not overcapacitated. It's important for us to make sure, moreover, that drivers themselves have the opportunity to take advanced driving lessons, to be able to deal and respond accordingly to incidents like these, like being hit behind by a bakkie in a manner that preserves lives and saves, children and their passengers. Moreover, I think it's important that drivers need to observe the rules of the road and ensure that they drive within the speed limits. And don't allow you, or don't essentially follow the bad driving practices that we see in the taxi industry when they disobey and negate the rules of the road. So drivers should not be, should not pick to fill their taxis because it means more money when they reach capacity for their vehicles. And we understand that many private scholar transport providers operate unlawfully because of the transport associations that are gatekeepers to routes and contracts as they determine who gets registered, who gets contracts, and who must pay membership fees. So there's a lot that needs to be done in order for us to be able to resolve this issue around private transport service providers and also scholar transport to ensure that children arrive alive when they're on their way to school and coming back.
So you're speaking to us in your capacity as a social justice advocate. Speak to us about how can advocacy efforts then ensure that policies on scholar transport really prioritize safety, but also accountability here?
I think it's important for us to be able to understand also that from a social justice perspective and from a socialist perspective, civil society organizations then come into the play to assist private transport service providers to be able to not only get their PDPs, but to also engage them in getting advanced driving lessons as well. I think as a society and from a private sector, or rather from a public service provider perspective, it is very important for civil society organizations that have been doing the work around scholar transport and the safety of learners and the safety also of drivers themselves and the rules and the regulations that they must, regulate under when it comes to lawfulness. I think it's important that organizations that have been doing the work need to be able to be brought into the forefront to have those conversations and facilitate engagement between the drivers and government, to facilitate engagement between the drivers, government, and parents as well. It's a multi-sectorial kind of engagement that needs to be done in order for us to ensure that we safeguard passengers on their way to school, and particularly in this context when we're speaking about learners. We need to be able to engage schools as well, and this is where social organizations come into play. CBOs, as we'd like to term them in my industry. This is where CBOs come into play, where they engage with school governing bodies, where they engage with parents as well, to be able to determine the needs of not only the learners, but the needs as well of the transport providers, in us being able to articulate and to find a very conducive manner in which learners can be brought to school and back, and also how these private transport providers can also make the money that they need in order to sustain the industry that they're in, as well as ensuring that students are brought to school on time. Because one of the other issues that scholar transports have is that students are normally late when going to school, and this is an issue that occurs within the home. So it's a multi-sectorial, and many various individuals and groupings need to be brought into this conversation in order for us to be able to regulate and to resolve it and to preserve lives.
What role can communities and civil society organizations play, Busi, in really advocating for safer scholar transport systems? You speak about the challenges, even when it comes to children arriving late for school.
I think it's important that we understand that, many communities are aware of the drivers that are non-compliant. They're unaware of the transport providers that, for an example, don't have enough seats for students and use makeshift seating. They are aware of the individuals that pack students, or learners rather, into their minibus taxis like sardines. They are aware of, the delinquents within that particular environment. And I think it's important for community members to be able to call those individuals out, to be able to stop those individuals from, transporting children. If they see them on the roads in the morning, if they see them picking up children, it needs to be a community and a societal effort. If we're going to be able to address a lot of the issues that we see, in Limpopo last year, we had 16 children pass away because a driver was trying to do an unlawful turn and maneuver by overtaking a truck. It's those little nuances that people are aware of. Some drivers go to work under the influence of narcotics or drugs or alcohol. And this is something that the community, this is something that parents are aware of. So we must not shy from holding everyone accountable for the kind of crisis that we find ourselves in, and the fact that it will require everyone to resolve it, including the community.
But are there successful models from other countries that South Africa could possibly adopt to really improve scholar transport safety?
There definitely are. There is a beautiful model in Ghana. There's a beautiful model in Ethiopia. There is another model in Tanzania as well. If we are to look across the continent of Africa, we are able to see where issues around scholar transport have been a continuous issue and continuous topic. Many countries have attempted to resolve this issue around scholar transport and private service providers from that perspective, and road fatalities. And when we do have a government that is willing to engage with other governments as well. So for an example, in the Gauteng provincial legislature, many of our MPLs rather, many of our MECs as well have international visits to other countries in order to learn and exchange, skills and development. I think one of the things that needs to be a priority in the upcoming cycle of skills development training, in terms of the international trips that our MECs and our MPLs will be taking, is to learn about the different transporting systems in countries like Tanzania, in Ghana, in Ethiopia, and to see how we can absorb them in order for them to work for us here in South Africa and to implement them. Countries like Brazil, countries like China, countries like Russia, which are BRICS countries as well, and we form a part of that coalition with BRICS, and we have an agreement with BRICS, can teach us as South Africans a lot about how to regulate scholar transport and how to essentially make it safer, and not just scholar transport, just the transporting industry in its entirety. And I think we must take advantage of the alliances that we have formed into and we have agreed to as a country, and to see how they can serve us to resolve a lot of the issues that we have on the ground.
But how can technology then also be leveraged to really enhance monitoring and safety measures in scholar transport services?
One of the things that China has been able to do extensively is that they've been able to implement a monitoring system in their scholar transport vehicles, in the sense that if a vehicle exceeds a particular speed limit, the car will not move to that speed limit. So if your car is at a speed limit of 120 and you try and go over 120, the car will not progress more than 120. Those are some of the technological models that China has implemented. For an example, even the traffic camera system that we have in Gauteng, which is a very sophisticated one, is able to monitor to a large extent those that are breaking the rules of the road. And we need to implement more harsher penalties than fines. I think fines are not working as people know that they can just pay money and get away with anything or breaking the rules of the road. And that is not conducive for, the rule of law in general. And I think we need to start implementing and using the technology that is available to us in Gauteng. Another instrument that has been used in countries like Russia as well is that every, driver, for an example, needs to continuously take advanced driving lessons that are monitored, and their driving is monitored as well while they're in the car, and there's a live feed that goes back to a particular department. And I think those are the things we need to look at. Those are the nuances around the technological advancements that we must implement in order for us to be able to address the issues around technology. But I do think us implementing a speed limit, one that is not controlled by the particular operator of that vehicle, one that forces a particular vehicle to move at a specific rate, will also help us in instances where drivers are rushing to get to school, where they are rushing and disobeying the rules of the road, and essentially bringing lawlessness onto the road that results in the fatalities that we're seeing from these children.
And what support systems are available, if any, that you know of for families who are affected by this tragedy when it comes to either the poor quality of these vehicles that are being used, or some of these issues that you've also highlighted in this interview?
I think it's important that parents must firstly be able to reach out to their nearest counseling center in order for them to effectively grieve and to come to not only terms with the unfortunate incident that has happened, but also to engage mechanisms and means on how to prevent it moving forward. There needs to be more engagement from civil society organizations themselves in terms of hosting community meetings to speak to parents, to speak to guardians around the safety of learners within this private transport security, the private transport services environment. And we need to be able as well to allow civil society organizations to be able to do, unauthorized inspections to some degree of these vehicles, for learners when they're on their way to school, in order for us to be able to evaluate who needs assistance in terms of, from the driver's perspective, what assistance do they need,
right,
what resources do they need to make available to them. But more than anything else, it's important for parents to pray over their children before they leave in the morning. I think an element of spirituality is also important. I mean, if we come together as South Africans and we pray to God to save the nation in our national anthem, I think it's okay for parents to pray over their children before they go to school every morning.
So, Busi, how does the socioeconomic background of some of these pupils then impact their safety and access to scholar transport services? You mentioned earlier on that some pupils might even have to travel long distances, mostly in suburbs, having children traveling from the township to the suburbs to go to school.
Definitely. I mean, the socioeconomic conditions of many of the people that are involved in this tragedy is part of the reason why we're even having this conversation in the first place. Most scholar patrol transports are essentially packed because parents can't afford a transport that has adequate space or capacity, and would rather pack their children into another transport because it means that they get to pay less, because essentially their child will either be standing or balancing on something. And that is a reality that we must face. And this is where government comes into play. because government had prioritized the delivery of education that was inextricably linked to ensuring that scholars had access to transport that allowed them to get to their schools. And this meant that, planning had and continues to be fragmented, with schools often being situated far from human settlements, with inadequate road infrastructure and many other issues that government is well aware of and has to resolve in order for them to implement, the priority that is linked to delivering education. And there are a number of aspects relating to scholar transport that government isn't engaging. And these included not only the actual provision of transport, and which the department should bear responsibility for, but also the discussion on the means through which this organized transport should be enforced and provided for people. So I think at this particular point in time, we need to be able to engage the MEC, we need to be able to engage the Minister of Education as well, and government in its entirety around, the priority of delivering education and the inextricably linked access to transport that goes along with it, to say that we are delivering education to some degree in certain places. However, even in that instance and in that context, the access to transport is something that is lacking on their part, and they need to be able to come to the forefront and resolve it.
Thank you so much, Busi Seabe, sharing her perspective on safer scholar transport and really giving us a unique insight into the challenges and needed reforms as well into this sector.